We are going to make a simple skirt today. So if you are a beginner to sewing, if you've never made anything before, you're in the right place. I'm gonna hold your hand. If you're like a beginner-ish, this is gonna be easy peasy. And if you're just like a cute person who wants a cute skirt, you're in the right place. This tutorial is a little extra special because not only am I giving you instructions on how to make a garment, but I'm also giving you a peek inside of my self-drafting process. So I'm going to show you from like finding an inspo pic, figuring out how do I make it look like that? How do I get the measurements? How do I figure out how much ease I want, down to the steps of actually sewing the garment. So that way, if you don't want to make a skirt exactly how I make mine with the same amount of tiers and the same length and all of that stuff, you can figure out exactly the kind of skirt you want to make, and I'll give you all the tools to figure it out yourself. So let's jump in. I've made a few different skirts. I think today I'm going to be making a skirt with 3 tiers, and I have this super cute fabric that's like a yellowish, greenish, citrusish gingham. I'm pretty sure it's a linen, and I think I got it from Modern Domestic, which is a fabric shop in Portland, but they do sell online as well. I'll see if I can find it and put it in the description. And then for the sake of the self-drafting tutorial, I have a pretty definite inspo pic that I'm going to kind of be replicating. So this is my Pinterest board of all of these different skirt ideas. There's a bunch of them in there, and I'll link my Pinterest too if you want to look at my skirt ideas that I've come up with. But the one I'm going to be looking at today is this one. So it is 3 tiers, but you can see there's like one really short tier here, a medium tier, and then a really long tier. So literally what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a tape measure and measure on the screen the whole length of the skirt. Obviously, her skirt ends up like above her shirt, so we can't quite see the top, but I'm just going to measure from the hem to where I'm pretty sure the skirt waistband is. My handy dandy tape measure. Okay, so on my screen, her skirt is 2.5 inches long. The bottom tier is about 1.5 of those inches. The middle tier is about 1 inch, and then the top tier is about 1/2 inch. What you want to do is plug those numbers into like a percentage calculator to figure out what percent is each tier. I'm going to adjust those numbers just a little bit based on what I think might look a little bit better. And so the percentages I'm going to be working with are 20% for the top tier, 30% for the middle tier, and 50% for the bottom tier. Now some math stuff comes in. I do a lot of like sketching and calculating while I'm self-drafting, so I'm going to show you that whole process, and then you can duplicate it to whatever numbers you are working with. First off, I'm just going to draw our skirt here. So beautiful. Okay, so we have the top tier is going to be 20%, middle tier is going to be 30%, and the bottom tier is going to be 50%. So first thing we need to figure out is how long of a skirt do we want? Literally what you need to do is take your tape measure, stand in front of a mirror, and measure from where you want the skirt to hit at your waist all the way down to where you want it to fall on your legs. For me, I want it to be able to be like belly button height, like my natural waist. I don't want it like super low. And then I want it to fall like a bit above my ankles. I think the inspo pic is pretty close. I'll probably do a bit longer than that. So for me, that measures 32 inches. So for the full length of the skirt, we want that to be 32 inches. Obviously, I'm doing all my measurements in inches because I'm from the US. If you use centimeters, that is obviously completely fine. All of your measurements will probably be different anyways because you're making your own skirt and not my skirt unless you are copying my exact skirt. But obviously, the math will still work out the same. Okay, so now that we have the total length and we have the percentages, we can figure out what length each tier is going to be. So 20% of 32 comes out to 6.4. 30% of 32 comes out to 9.6, and then 50% of 32 comes out to 16. Okay, so that would be like the finished length of the tiers, but we need to add in things like seam allowance and hems and all of that stuff. First, I'm going to add in seam allowances. So at each of these tiers, right, when we're adding one tier on top of the other, we're going to have a seam allowance there. For me, I'm just gonna make it easy and say my seam allowance is 1/2 inch. So I would be adding 0.5 inches to this side, 0.5 inches to that side, same here, 0.5, 0.5. And then for the hem on the bottom, first I'll fold it up 1/2 inch, and then I'm going to fold it up 2 inches. I like a nice sturdy hem. 2 inches I feel like is great. You can do a smaller hem, a bigger hem. You can also plan for a bigger hem just in case. And then once you like try it on, you can decide that you want a smaller one and cut some off or whatever. So 1/2 inch first and then 2 inches. Great. For the waistband, I'm going to be using 3/4 inch elastic. I've also made some with like 1.5 inch or 2 inch elastic if you want like a really thick waistband. I think for the look of this skirt, I just want something a bit thinner. So 3/4 inch elastic, so I need to account for that. But when I fold that over, I'm first going to be folding it 3/8 of an inch and then the 3/4 of an inch. So I also need to add 3/8 of an inch, which is 0.375. And then I also do this little detail on the waistband of most skirts and like sometimes pants that I make where I add a little flat section on top. I'll put a picture here so you can kind of visualize what I'm talking about. But I'm going to add an extra 1/2 inch for that. It's about 1/4 inch tall, but I need to account for that twice because it's folded over. If that doesn't make sense, you can skip over that. But I'm going to add an extra 1/2 inch to account for that. Okay, so now we have our main measurements and then all the extra things we need to add in. So for this top tier, we're gonna do 6.4 plus 0.75 plus 3.375 plus 0.5 plus 0.5. So all of that works out to 8.525. I'm just gonna round that up to, or down I guess, to 8.5. So that is my final length for the top tier. I'm gonna do the same thing with the middle tier. That comes out to 10.6 when I add the extras. I'm just gonna round that down to 10.5. There's that one. Bottom tier, I'm just adding 3 inches because 2 inches, 0.5, 0.5, 3 inches is 19 inches. Beautiful. Okay, now that we have the lengths of our tiers, we need to figure out how wide we want it to be. So the way that I figure this out is I base it on my waist circumference or my hip circumference. So for me, my waist is 31 inches around. Also, this fluctuates like basically every day. So if you like kind of think you know your measurements, I would just measure yourself really quickly. And then my hips are 42 inches at the widest point, so like around your butt. So for me, my waist to hip ratio, like I'm quite pear-shaped. So I want to take into account my hip circumference for sure, because if I'm just going off my waist, typically that tends to make things on my lower half quite tight. So make sure you measure yourself and are considering your body while you're making the things for your body. Okay, so my general rule for things that are gathered, because this skirt is going to be 3 tiers that are gathered. The top tier is going to be gathered within an elastic waistband. So my general rule when I gather things is 1.5. So whatever the measurement is, and then you take it 1.5 out to gather it in. However, I wouldn't just blindly run with that. Let's kind of test this theory. So if I'm going off of my waist measurement, if I 1.5x'd my waist, then that would make the circumference 46.5 inches, right? So we're talking about the top tier there. So what would be a good idea to do is, if that's like the hypothesis you're running with, is maybe the top tier will be 46.5 inches wide. Literally pull that on your tape measure and put it around your body. Okay, so I have 46.5 here on my tape measure, and I'm going to put it around my body. Okay, so you can see if it's around my waist, that's a lot of ease. I have plenty of movement here, but if it's around my hips, it's not a ton. Like, it's enough, but it's not a ton. Another thing to consider is this first tier for me, I'm making my tier quite short. The tier is probably gonna stop above the widest point of my hips. So I can be a little bit tighter than it would be if this tier was going, right? Like at the widest point. So it's probably gonna fall about there. I feel like I have a decent amount of ease, but would probably prefer a little bit extra wiggle room. So what I'm going to do, I am just going to round that up to an even 50 inches. That feels solid to me. Another thing you could consider is going with your hip measurement and doing 1.5 times your hip measurement, especially if your first tier, or if you're just doing one skirt with no tier, you would probably want to take your hips into more account in that situation. Because like for me, like I said, that top tier isn't really covering the widest point of my hips anyway. So these are just the things to think through as you're self-drafting things out, like where are things going to land, what parts of your body are going to matter, and then just taking a hypothesis and running with it. I feel like this is a good time to mention too that your first skirt that you make, maybe consider it like a practice skirt. Like chances are it's going to be cute and you'll be able to wear it, but kind of in the back of your head, think of it as like this is your first run at it, and whatever you learn from this process, the next skirt you make is going to be like 10 times better. So we're gonna run with 50 inches and see how that goes. Okay, so now I know my top tier of my skirt is going to be 8.5 inches long times 50 inches wide. And that is like the whole circumference of the skirt. So for the width of the middle tier, like I said, you could just 1.5 times that. For me, I made a practice skirt yesterday, which is the one I'm wearing, and I did 1.5 times my tiers, and I feel like it turned out cute, but it is quite full. It's probably more full than I would want it to be. So I'm going to multiply it by 1.4 just to take out a smidge of that fullness. So taking 50 times 1.4 gives me 70 inches. So my middle tier is going to be 10.5 inches by 70 inches all the way around. And then same thing with the bottom tier, I'm going to multiply 70 by 1.4, which gives me 98. So the bottom tier will be 19 by 98. This is coming along so well. Also, I genuinely love this portion of it. I feel like it's very fun. Okay, so now we need to figure out what we're actually going to cut. So how we're going to assemble this skirt. We're going to create the front of the skirt and then the back of the skirt, and then we're going to stick them together. We're partially doing it that way because then the gathers don't get quite as intimidating because you're not gathering a huge circumference of a skirt, you're just gathering the front or back panels. But also I'm going to give you the option to put pockets in your skirt if you want them. You don't have to do them, but if you are doing pockets, making a front and back and then attaching it is much easier than doing like tubes of fabric and adding them to each other. So because we're cutting a front and a back, we need to divide these widths in half. I should also mention you can account for seam allowance here because when you attach the front and the back, there will be seam allowance along the sides of the skirt. For something like this where it's very gathered, there's a lot of room for error, it's not like we're creating a form-fitting bodysuit or anything like that, I often feel like those seam allowances are kind of negligible. So if you wanted to add in like 1/2 inch or 1 inch seam allowances along the sides of your skirt, go for it. I'm just gonna kind of move forward because like I said, there's so much gathering happening, I really don't think it's gonna make a ton of a difference. Hopefully this gives you a peek inside of my process. I'm very loosey-goosey with this stuff, especially when I'm drafting stuff for myself. Okay, so our panels of fabric. We are going to need 2 panels for the top, the front and the back. The length stays the same, we're just cutting the width in half. So we need 2 panels that are 8.5 inches by 25 inches. For the middle tier, we need 2 panels that are 10.5 by, not 70, 35. And then for the bottom, we would need 2 panels that are 19 by 49. Now, this number 49 here jumps out at me as a problem because most fabric is between 44 inches wide and about 60 inches wide. It mostly depends on if it's like a quilting cotton or an apparel fabric, which tends to be a little bit wider. But my fabric that I am using is 44 inches wide. So I cannot cut a panel that is 49 inches wide straight across. So what I'm going to need to do with the bottom tier is I'm going to need to cut 4 panels and stick those together. And I know I literally just said I'm not gonna worry about the width seam allowance, but I actually am in this case. Because there will be a seam in the center front and center back on the bottom tier, I'm going to add 1 inch to each panel. Instead of 2 of these panels, we're going to make 4 panels, same length, but we're going to cut the 49 in half, which would give us 24.5, but like I said, I'm gonna add an extra inch for that seam allowance, so we're going to make it 25.5. Beautiful. Now, if you want to figure out how much fabric you're going to need for your skirt, this is a good time to do it. From these rectangles that you're doing, you can add up these lengths. So the width of your fabric, kind of depending on what it is, you're only going to get one cut across with each of these rectangles. Like 25, you'd only be able to cut one, right? Because if my fabric's 44 inches, you couldn't cut two of those next to each other. So 25 would be one, 35 would be one, 25.5 would be one across. So you'll have a little bit of fabric left over on the edges, but adding these lengths will tell you how much fabric you'll need. I hope this makes sense. So anyway, essentially, you need 2 lengths of 8.5, which would be 17 inches, 2 lengths of 10.5, which would be 21 inches, and 4 lengths of 19, which would be 76 inches. Add those all together, that comes out to 114 inches. Divide that by 36, because that's how many inches in a yard, and you would get 3.16 yards. So I would definitely round that up to 3 1/4, maybe even 3 1/2, just to be safe. Sometimes fabric you could cut is a little bit wonky, or it's nice to have a little bit extra. So for my skirt, I'm gonna need at least 3 1/4 yards of fabric. If you don't want to go through the hassle of figuring out like exactly how much fabric you need, I feel like 3 to 4 yards is a very, very safe guess, especially if you're doing less than 3 tiers. Like if I was only doing 2 tiers, I feel like I wouldn't need nearly that much. I'd probably only do like 2 1/2 yards, but that's just a guess. Okay, how exciting. So now we have the panels we need to cut. Last thing I want to talk about, like I said, I am doing pockets in my skirt. You don't have to do pockets, especially if, like I said, you've never made anything before ever. You could skip them. They're not really that hard, so I believe in you if you want to do them. But if you just want to keep it super simple, you don't need to do pockets. Another thing to consider with anything like skirts that are elastic waistband, especially if you're making your waistband kind of on the looser side, adding pockets and then putting like your phone in your pocket can like pull your skirt down. So sometimes I don't even put pockets in because I feel like it kind of drags the material down your body. But also if I don't add pockets, I'm like constantly like looking for them while I'm wearing them. So I'm just gonna add them this time and we'll walk through that process. So if you wanna do pockets, you'll need to draw a pattern piece for your pocket. This is obviously something that you'll just need to feel confident about, and I 100% believe in you. You can do something that's like similar to this shape. You need one side that is like a straight line, and then as for the rest of it, it's kind of just like lima bean shaped, and truly you can just put your hand on it to see if it feels like, okay, like my hand can go in here, or like put your phone on it, see if it makes sense. And like I said, if you're doing this for the first time, think of your first skirt as a practice skirt, and so you really can't mess the pockets up too crazy bad. Also, for reference, this pocket that I drew is about 8.5 inches wide and 10.5 inches long. But the main thing is that you need one flat edge that you will be able to fit your hand into with a little bit of room on the top and bottom for seam allowance. So that is the pocket. And then the only other thing you need besides your fabric is elastic. Like I said, I'm using 3/4 inch braided elastic. You can use whatever width you want. Just make sure you're accounting for that when you do all of your math. And once you have elastic, a pocket bag, some fabric, thread, pins, I think you'll be good to go. All right, let's sew a freaking skirt. Wait, sorry, there is one thing that I need to mention. I'm not going to film the cutting process because we're just cutting rectangles, but the one thing that you do need to make sure that you're doing is that you're cutting parallel to the selvage edge, which means you're cutting like on the grain of the fabric. So for example, this fabric, you can see this edge here is the selvage edge because it's the edge that is kind of like frayed a little bit, I guess. And you need to be cutting parallel to that. So like these are like the lengths and then the widths. You want the gathers to be going this way, like with the selvage on this side. You don't want it to be gathered this way on the selvage. Do you see that's the selvage? Because the fabric is going to gather better like this than it is like this. Does that make any sense? Just make sure you're cutting it parallel to the selvage edge. I'll meet you guys back when you have all your skirt panels cut. All right, I have cut all my panels. I have 4 for the bottom tier. Like we talked about, my fabric wasn't wide enough just to do the 2. So I have 4 panels for my bottom tier, 2 for my middle tier, and 2 for my top tier. I've also cut out 4 pocket pieces. You need to do that if you are doing pockets. And they are 2 directions mirrored. So if your fabric has a wrong side and a right side, make sure you do 2 of each. Now, if you have any tiers like my bottom tier where the width wouldn't fit with just one cut and you had to cut multiple panels, combine those first before we do anything else. So you can see here, I've combined them. I just did a straight stitch and then finished off my raw edge with my serger. So now I have the full width of that bottom tier. Now we're going to jump into the actual construction. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to lay just one panel out of each tier to visualize better. Because basically what we're going to do is we are going to gather each tier and attach it to the tier above it. So we're going to start off with the top tier and the middle tier. We're going to sew a row of basting stitches along this top edge of the middle tier and then attach it to the top. So here we have that middle tier where we just pointed out where we're going to sew this basting stitch. And basically what a basting stitch is it is just a very long stitch length. So the longest setting on my machine is 5 millimeters, which is what I'm doing here. And that allows us to pull the threads to gather the fabric, which you'll see in just a moment. We're going to do 2 rows of basting stitches, which helps the gathers be more even. So the first row, which we just did, is at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And then the second row, which we're starting now, is at 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Make sure you don't do any back stitches and you want to leave some tails on the ends of this stitch, tails of the threads. And this is what the finished result should look like. 2 nice parallel rows of basting stitches. Okay, here we have the top tier of our skirt and we are going to lay on top of it our middle tier that we just stitched those basting stitches. And first, before we attach it, we need to find the center. So I'm just going to fold it in half and make a teeny tiny snip. Make sure you don't snip the stitches you just did. And then do the same with the top tier so you know where the center of each is. And then you're going to pin the left side to the left side, the center to the center, and the right side to the right side. And this just helps keep everything nice and even if you have kind of those marker points set. And what we're going to do is gather half of this at a time. So starting with the left half, you can see we have 4 threads poking out, 2 on the back and 2 on the front. You want to find the 2 front threads. Those are the ones we're going to pull. So get a good grip on those front threads, and then you're going to pinch the rest of the fabric. Once you have a good grip on everything, start to pull. And I kind of hold my left hand stationary and I'm pulling more with the pinched fabric than I am with the threads. So you can see here, just kind of grip and pull, grip and pull, grip and pull until you make these little gathers in the fabric. And what you want to do is you want to gather it until the middle tier, which is the gathered fabric, is pretty flush along the top tier, which is flat. So you'll kind of keep gathering and keep adjusting things until it's all kind of evened out. And this is why you only do half at a time, because if you try to gather the whole thing, it can be quite overwhelming. So once those gathers feel pretty even, you can go ahead and pin them in place. Great, that side is looking beautiful. Now you just need to repeat the process on the other side. So this time you'll take the threads on the right and pull them toward the middle. So once everything is completely gathered on both sides, you're ready to stitch it in place. So you can see here you have your 2 rows of basting stitches, and what we're going to do is do a 3rd stitch just below the 2nd row. So it will be at a 1/2 of an inch seam allowance. Some people prefer to do this straight stitch in between the 2 rows of basting stitches. That does produce a nice even gather, but personally I feel like it's kind of a waste of time because then you have to unpick that bottom row of basting stitches because it will show on the other side. So I prefer to do my straight stitch below the 2 rows of basting stitches. I feel like I still get a great even result and I don't have to unpick anything, which is a win for me for sure. So as you're stitching these gathers in place, make sure that the gathers are staying even, they don't get too bunched up anywhere. You can see as I'm going, I kind of use my left hand to pull the fabric to the left a little bit, pull it flat, pull it taut, if you will, so that the gathers are staying very even. And your finished result should look something like this. You can see the 2 rows of basting stitches and then the smaller row of straight stitch just beneath it. Now we just need to finish off the raw edge here. So I have a serger, also called an overlocker, so it makes it super duper easy for me to just serge my edges. If you do not have one, that is completely fine. You can absolutely finish your edges with your regular machine. A zigzag stitch is the most common way to do it, and I have a video that shows how to do a zigzag stitch and also other kinds of stitches to finish off your raw edges with a regular machine, so I'll link that here. Once you finished off those edges, they should look like this, and now your gathers are beautiful. I also like to press my gathers after I sew them, just to make them a little bit less poofy, a little bit more like streamlined, and it really isn't too hard of a press either. I just kind of lightly go over them to make them, again, not so poofy. All right, beautiful. And I will mention I'm only showing one side of the skirt, right? This is either the front or the back. It's reversible, but you'll need to repeat these steps on the other side of your skirt. Now we are going to gather and attach our bottom tier of the skirt, which is basically the same process, it's just much bigger. So you can see here, I've already done the rows of basting stitches along this bottom tier. The only thing I'm going to do differently is instead of just folding it in half, I'm actually going to fold it in fourths so that I find the center point and then also the 2 quarter points so that I have more kind of touch points to attach to itself so that, again, the gathers aren't quite so overwhelming. So here I will align and pin together the left sides, and then I'll find my next snips, which will be the 1 quarter point. Then my next snips will be the midway center point, then the 3 quarter point, and then I'll line up the right sides of the fabric. And this time when I start to pull my gathers, I'm still going to pull all the way through to that center pin. So you'll be gathering 2 quadrants is what I typically call them, quadrants of gathers, because you have 4 sections between pins. So you're going to gather through those 2 quadrants to the center pin, get those all evenly gathered, pin those in place, and then again, you'll start from the right side of the fabric and gather toward the center through the last 2 quadrants. Once everything is gathered, you can go ahead and stitch it in place just like we did the last tier. Everything is exactly the same. And at that point, you will have 1/2 of your skirt. If you did no tiers, 2 tiers, or 3 tiers, you're ready to move on to pockets. If you're not doing pockets, you can skip ahead. I'll put the timestamps in the description. But if you are doing pockets, you're going to need to finish the curved edges of all of the pockets. So if you have a serger or overlocker, just go ahead and do that along that curved edge. If you don't, you can again use my tutorial on how to finish raw edges with your regular machine. So repeat that on all 4 of your pocket pieces. Next, you're going to need to figure out where you want your pockets to land on your body. And it's going to depend on where you are putting your waistband of your skirt. So for me, I'm just measuring from where my skirt is going to fall on my waist down to where like my hand naturally goes into a pocket, which for me was about 3 inches down. And then I added an extra inch because of all the stuff going on in the waistband area. I have a 3/4 inch wide elastic waistband, and then I'm also, of course, folding it under the raw edge under a bit as well. So in total, I added 1 extra inch and attached my pocket 4 inches down from the raw edge. Also, no worries if your pocket ends up falling right on the line of a tier. Mine did, and it turned out totally fine. I'm going to go in with my serger and finish off the raw edge of my skirt where the pocket is attached, which will simultaneously attach my pocket to the edge of the skirt as well. Again, you can totally do this with your regular machine the same way that you've been finishing all your other raw edges. Once that's attached, you can fold your pocket back and give it a little bit of a press. Make sure you're repeating these steps on both sides of your skirt and the front and back pieces. All right, now you should have a finished front and back piece of your skirt. So lay them on top of each other, right sides together, and pin along the side. If you have pockets, you will be pinning around the curve of the pockets, and make sure you line up any appropriate tiers that need to be lined up. Make sure you pin both sides together, and then what we are going to do is we're going to do a straight stitch along the side of your skirt. If you don't have pockets, it's just a straight line all the way down, and if you do have pockets, you're going to pivot at each top and bottom of the pocket. So you can see here, you kind of get to the bottom, I back stitch a little bit, and then I pick up my presser foot, pivot around, and go around the curve of that pocket. Again, when you get to the side of the skirt, back stitch a little bit, and then pivot to continue your straight stitch down to the bottom of your skirt. Once you've done that, you are going to press your seam open flat. And if you have pockets, don't worry too much about the pockets. I just press right up until I get to the pocket, but you don't need to be pressing anything around the pocket. It will look just fine. Now we're going to create a channel for the elastic waistband. So when we did all of our calculations, we decided how much we were going to fold down this channel for the elastic waistband. So for me, I first folded it down 3/8 of an inch, and then I took into account 1 inch because I have a 3/4 inch elastic and then an extra 1/4 inch for that little flat section that we will get to. So your measurements might be different than mine, but I am folding mine down 3/8 of an inch and then 1 inch. And it's always a good idea to double check your measurements. I am pretty good at eyeballing these days, but I still need to double check and re-press things from time to time. Once that's all pressed in place, we are going to do an edge stitch, which is basically just a straight stitch, but instead of like a specific seam allowance, we are just stitching right along the edge of where we folded this waistband. But the one unique thing we are going to do here is when you go around the circumference of this waistband, you are not going to close off your stitch. Instead, you are going to stop about 1.5 inches before you close your stitch to leave a little bit of a gap right there. And then if you are going to do that little flat section that I do, it's completely optional. I do it at about 1/8 of an inch seam allowance, maybe a hair more than that. And I just go around the entire top of the waistband. So you can see here, I have my little gap I've left on my edge stitch. And then I also have that straight stitch along the top that makes a little flat edge. Now we're going to insert your elastic into the channel that you just sewed. So put a safety pin at the end of your elastic and poke that through the hole that you left, that little gap there. And then you are going to just guide your safety pin all the way through the channel and out around the other end. And one thing I forgot to mention is how to determine the length of your elastic. The way I always do it is I just cut it the same length as my waist circumference, which for me is 31 inches, because it is going to overlap a smidge. So it will end up being about 30.5 inches probably. And that will give a little bit of, elasticity on my waist, but it's completely up to you. You can do it a little bit tighter than that. If you want your waistband tighter, you can do it looser than your waist. I just always cut it to my exact waist circumference. Keep pulling your safety pin through that channel you've created. Make sure that the elastic doesn't get completely sucked up into the channel though. You don't want to lose it in there. But once it comes out the other side, that safety pin, you can then pin together the two ends of your elastic. And you can see here, I had pinned the other end in place just so it didn't get sucked into the channel. So here I have my two ends. I'm going to overlap them about 1/2 inch, maybe a smidge more, and pin that in place. Now to attach the two ends of this elastic, we are going to do a zigzag stitch, and I make mine nice and wide and lengthen the stitch a little bit as well. But my feed dogs, it might just be my machine, my feed dogs don't love sewing on elastic like this, and so I often have to do quite a bit of back stitching, lifting my needle up, lifting my presser foot up, just to kind of get it to move where I want it to move. And if you have to do the same thing, no worries at all. This will not be visible, so attach it however you can attach it. It doesn't have to be pretty. As long as it is securely in place, you can then pull that elastic down through the channel so that it lays nice and flat. And then we are going to close up that little hole you left with a straight stitch. It's the same exact method as we did the edge stitch before. Just make sure that you backstitch a little bit at the beginning and at the end to really keep that hole firmly in place, and also make sure that you're not accidentally stitching on top of the elastic. Now that that is in that channel, it can be a little bit difficult to go around it. So just kind of keep your finger on it and make sure that you're not stitching on top of the elastic. All right, wonderful. Now you have a completed elastic waistband, and you can kind of pull at it and get the scrunched up gathers even around the entire circumference of your waist. Now, sometimes with elastic waistbands, the elastic can tend to fold or twist around in that channel while you're wearing it. So I'm going to show you a little bit of a trick that I do. I sew a little line in this ditch of the seam here. So this is just the side seam of the skirt. I'm sewing right in the ditch of that seam so that you can't really see it very well. I lengthen my stitch length just a little bit to make it easier through all those layers. backstitch a few times, go over it a little bit, and then you can see here I have a little row of stitches just to keep that elastic in place and from folding over. So I do that on both of my side seams. It's completely optional, you don't have to, but it can help with twisting. You are so close to finishing your skirt, all you need to do is hem it. So when I did all the math at the beginning, I decided that I would first fold the raw edge under 1/2 inch, and then I would fold it over again 2 inches. So that is what I'm doing here. First 1/2 inch, then 2 inches. Your measurements might be different based on what you decided to do. But I'm pressing that in place. I'm not pinning it just because it's not that huge of a hem. It feels like it stays in place pretty well, but you can pin this if you want to keep it in place. This is also a very good time after you've pressed it to try it on and make sure it's the right length. And if it is, you can go ahead and edge stitch along that hem. I also tend to lengthen my stitch length for hems, just because it feels like the right thing to do. So that is completely optional, but I feel like it makes it go faster as well. So I'm edge stitching at 3.5 millimeters stitch length here. So stitch around that entire hem, backstitch when you get back to where you started, and then you should have a completed skirt. I am so happy with how my tiers turned out. I love the percentages I went with. Hopefully you were able to kind of customize and do whatever version you wanted. For this one in particular, for me, I really wanted a skirt that I could wear with like a long shirt that would cover up that first tier entirely, so it looks like I just have 2 tiers. And then if I wanted to wear something more cropped or more fitted like this shirt, it would show all 3 of the tiers. So anyway, tag me in your makes. I want to see them, and let me know what tutorial you need next.